If I can go back a little bit, your work in obtaining classified documents have revealed many things from before the military coup in Brazil in 1964. And one of the most startling revelations is that President Kennedy, so well regarded in Brazil, was insistent in changing, in bringing down the government of President João Goulart. You started with the very first time that a conversation in the Oval Office was taped, secretly taped, and President Kennedy started to discuss in 1962, in July of 1962, the convenience of getting rid of President João Goulart.
The history of U.S. policy in the region has been one of what political scientists call the hegemonic presumption. The presumption of U.S. policymakers that they have hegemonic control over what goes on in Latin America. And that was particularly true decades ago, before the Cold War and during the Cold War. João Goulart simply was too independent for the United States. And it wasn't that he was a communist. It wasn't that they felt that he was going to turn Brazil over to the Soviet Union or create a base in Brazil for the Soviet Union. It was that he was too willing for the United States to deal with the other leftist movements and leftist advocates in Brazil, who the United States felt was influenced by the Soviets and would eventually somehow take over power. They would basically push Goulart aside eventually and assume power. And of course, Brazil was the key actor in Latin America then, and the key actor in Latin America today. And there wasn't a little country like the island of Cuba or a sliver on the other side of Latin America called Chile. It was a major regional power. And that increased the concern in the White House even more. The key issue was that the United States of America and John Kennedy realized they weren't going to be able to control the social processes if Goulart unleashed them in Brazil.
In October of '63, the State Department defends that an intervention of the U.S. in the Brazilian political scene is not a good idea, is not recommendable. But on the 7th of October, President Kennedy asks Lincoln Gordon, the American ambassador in Brazil, if a military intervention will be desirable. So there was no turning back, apparently, at that point.
Well, you have to read these documents very carefully, and this is part of the art of understanding declassified U.S. documents. The State Department has many, many levels. The professional analysts understood things about Brazil that the political people did not. Lincoln Gordon really was very anti-Goulart, and he was one of the key people pressing for a coup in Brazil. He became the point man along with Vernon Walters, the military attaché. In fact, he was responsible for making Walters the attaché so that they would have somebody who spoke Portuguese, who could talk to all the generals, who could start to coordinate the Brazilian military's efforts to overthrow Goulart. But what you're seeing at this point is parts of the U.S. government that understand Brazil better saying, you know, there are no conditions for a coup in Brazil. The Brazilian military is not political right now, is not ready for a coup. To push for a coup now, it will be revealed. We will be identified in the face of the world of trying to overthrow Goulart. This will be horrible for us. This will incite the left, not only in Brazil, but in other countries throughout the region. We don't want this. Then you have people like Lincoln Gordon saying, the hell with that argument, you know, let's get in there and overthrow this guy. And increasingly the Kennedys saying, sure, if it can be done, let's try and do it.
You revealed that in the day of Kennedy's assassination, the 22nd of November of '63, he would have read, it was sent to him, a memorandum citing a plan of the American embassy in Brazil with heavy emphasis on armed intervention. And with plans, delivery of gasoline, armaments, and positioning of a naval task force on the coast of Brazil.
Yes, the plan that came to be known as Operation Brother Sam.
Brother Sam.
Yes, which luckily it wasn't called Operation Tio Sam. You know, I mean, it is imperialist enough as Brother Sam. But of course, we were not a brother to the Brazilians. We were basically deciding that we were going to determine the future of Brazil, not Brazil itself. And the CIA was working in Rio, in Sao Paulo, in some of the other areas, trying to create instability and influence the Brazilian generals to start to coordinate their efforts to overthrow Goulart. And these were operations that were being stepped up at the moment that Kennedy was killed. They then, of course, came to fruition about 5 months after his death in April, in March and April of '64.
Four years after the coup, we had an institutional act in Brazil, 1968. Repression became very, very hard. And I'll go towards that in a moment. But before that, the relationship then, the tone of the relationship between the military in Brazil and the White House changed completely, 180 degrees. In December of 1971, Nixon and Emílio Garrastazu Médici had a discussion, according to the documents that you came up with, in how to have how Brazil could help in a coup in Chile against Allende, how Brazil could help put down the regime of Fidel Castro and the Peruvian regime of General Velasco Alvarado. Apparently, the military in Brazil were willing to do a bunch of work. I don't know if only in behalf of the United States, but at least in concert with the United States.
I think the word that you used, in concert, is exactly correct. Brazil had its own regional interests, and the Brazilian military didn't want popular unity, populist, socialist elected governments around it. It didn't want such a government in Chile. It didn't want such a government in Uruguay. It didn't want a populist president in Bolivia. It wanted to surround itself with other military regimes so there'd be far less pressure on the Brazilian military to yield power and far greater ability to kind of protect its borders from leftists coming back and forth through neighboring countries. And so the Brazilian military started up its own efforts, its own covert operations to overthrow Allende. And what you see in this extraordinary memoranda of conversation, which we obtained a number of years ago and posted on our website at the National Security Archive, what you see is the military president of Brazil, Medici, explaining to Richard Nixon that Allende was going to fall the same way João Goulart fell, and that his people, his operators, his military operatives, his intelligence agents were already in Chile working with the Chilean military. And of course, Richard Nixon's ears perk up and he says, "Is that right? Well, maybe we can help out with that. Why don't we set up a secret system of communication between us so that we can send back channel messages from me to you without anybody else knowing."
But this back channel between the presidencies of the United States and Brazil, these actions coordinated by the Brazilian military, they were not what became known later as the Operation Condor, were they?
No.
That was a different set of actions.
Operation Condor was a regional set of cross-border counter-terrorism, supposedly, operations, but really what they were was a murder incorporated, a rendition, a regional rendition program coordinated by the intelligence services of the Southern Cone countries. It was an operation set up by the Pinochet regime. They invited Brazil to come participate. They invited the Argentine secret police, the Uruguayan military, the Argentine military, all to come and meet in Santiago in 1975 to design a system of coordination to spy on leftists throughout the region, to engage in political assassinations, torture, kidnapping of those militants, and eventually even civilians.
The invitation was accepted and the action took place?
Yes, the Brazilians sent 2 delegates to the second Condor meeting, and one of them at least walked out of the meeting and then informed the Central Intelligence Agency of what had happened in the meeting and painted a picture, a rather benign picture of Brazil not wanting to participate in assassination operations, but willing to provide the communication system, Condor Tel, it was called, so that the countries could secretly communicate with one another about their intelligence sharing and their rendition programs, their kidnapping, their torture, their assassinations. Brazil also hosted some meetings and entered into bilateral agreements with Argentina to kidnap and arrest and turn over suspected militants from Argentina. But we have at least one Brazilian document which has been uncovered in Brazil, which shows that, in fact, Brazil was participating with the Chilean secret police, DINA, in assassinating Brazilians in Europe. And this is a very important revelation. I believe that the Brazilian Truth Commission will shed much further light on those operations. And I think we're going to find a whole different history of Brazil's role in Operation Condor. I predict to you today on your program that when the Brazilian intelligence archives are ever recovered from the Brazilian military, which has kept them under wraps all these years, the whole history of intervention in the Southern Cone in Latin America will be rewritten. Brazil will be understood to be far more of a key actor in overthrowing Allende in Chile and intervening in Uruguay in 1971 to stop the election of a popular unity government there, and participating in the overthrow of Torres in Bolivia and the ascension of Hugo Banzer in Bolivia, in working with the United States on a series of operations throughout the region to block the left, undercut popular movements. I believe the history of Latin America will be rewritten with Brazilian archives. It's very important for the United States to declassify all of its archives on Brazil, but eventually we need Brazil to declassify all of its documents in order to truly understand what happened in the Southern Cone during the Cold War.